Oh, well. Well, it looks like top of the hour plus one to me. So, you want to get
Take
started,
us
Beth?
away.
All right, then. Well, for those of you that may not know me, I am the Lord Curmudgeon, otherwise known as Mark, because Beth will probably use my real name more than anything else. So, um, today I'm doing a presentation on building personal character arcs. And the reason why I enjoy personal character arcs is because they give you a way to build a character outside of the main core plot. And, you don't have to do that. Not every character needs its own personal character arcs. Some characters are just fine without them. But those characters that you really love and that you really want to explore can benefit from doing personal character arcs. And not just doing one, but doing one where people will remember the character, that you'll remember the experience of writing for the character, and that, you know, 10, 15 years down the road, you'll still talk about that character arc and say, gosh, that was really great. Um, so, so that's what we're going to get into. Um, couple of things I want to point out is that, we write stories, and every story that we write is a journey. It's not just for the plot, but it's for the people who are living inside of that plot. So, um, in that way, people who are reading these stories, they don't necessarily fall in love with the events of the story necessarily. They fall in love with what changes about the characters as they live in these stories. So, to define what a personal character arc really is, it's the internal evolution of a character's beliefs, fears, and identities as they go through these stories. And that's kind of what we're going to go through, kind of how to make that happen. Um, I've got a few examples of some of the personal character arcs. You've got Frodo Baggins for an instant, because I'm a Lord of the Rings nerd too. Um, he goes through a grand arc of his burdened innocence kind of evolves into resilient wisdom later on in the story, and that's one of the reasons why Frodo Baggins is such a popular character is because he evolves that way. It's not just because J.R.R. Tolkien's a really good writer, it's that the character, you feel the evolution that he went through.
Hey, Mark,
Yeah,
are you advancing your PowerPoint?
I am not. I am not.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay,
I'm
just
I'm
checking
still
in because
I'm still talking about the front
you're still
pages.
extemporaneous. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stuck. You're good to go.
No, you're not stuck yet. If I advance the slide in a second and you
I
don't see
will.
anything, then we will be stuck. But
I will wait
so far,
and
the technology is working.
huzzah!
Right? So, in fact, let me go ahead and advance to the next slide.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, some of those pictures you see up there, those are characters that I've written for recently that pretty much all of them except one. One of them is a reason for a personal character arc to be developed, but less said the better there. No spoilers. But to define the what is a personal character arc again, you see, it's an internal evolution. So it's your characters going through something or experiencing things in a way that tests them, that challenges them, that pushes them towards growth that wouldn't otherwise happen if you didn't put them through any of these tests, because no character and no person evolves without external stimuli, for the most part. It's the general rule. um, so to look at the distinction between plot and an arc. Plot happens to the person, or the character in this case. The arc is what happens inside of them. So you can have a character inside whatever plot you want. The plot doesn't necessarily shape them. I mean, they're going through the motions, they're doing the thing, but if you never show how it is affecting them on the inside, they're just in the plot. They're they're not growing from it, they're not evolving, they're not changing. They're just background characters in the plot. So you use personal character arcs as a way to show the emotional logic that ties the external events to their internal transformation that you are actually looking for them to go through. So there's three anchor questions that you should probably look to using when you're trying to develop your personal character arcs. It's, what does my character believe about themselves or the world when you start writing for them? What are their core beliefs? What do they think about themselves? Do they feel like, I'm not good enough to do this thing, or I'm put in a position that I don't really feel I deserve or I earned, or, any of those things? Those are just some narrow examples. But, it's any core belief that you, as a writer, will then turn around and challenge later. And then you have to ask yourself, what challenge will test that belief? You know, what external stimuli or what about a plot that your character is involved in is going to test the prime belief that they have about themselves or the world when that plot started. And that may develop as you're going through the story. It may not be something that you storyboard before you even start writing the character. You may not know what's going to challenge them, but when you see it, write it down, or however you storyboard your characters. I'm really bad at just throwing my characters into the middle of things and going, "Good luck." But, there's other people that like to storyboard and like to sketch out, well, I want my character to experience this, 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 and this. You may not necessarily storyboard how they're going to react until you actually get there, but kind of having a general idea of what you're going to put your character through can help. And then the last question is, what truth or lie will they walk away from at the end of this experience? So, you know, kind of thinking in terms of how are they going to grow? What do you want them to become when it's all said and done? Um, that's that's another question that you probably want to think about as you're developing your character arcs. Um, so I'll throw out a couple of examples that my lovely AI program helped me generate because I love using tools. Um, the story arc with Tony Stark is a good one that goes from narcissism to sacrifice. And his belief was that self-preservation for most of his, you know, time through at least the cinematic universe. I haven't read every comic and book there is, but his thought that self-preservation was more important than any sort of responsibility is tested, and it ends with his arc of sacrifice at the end. There's other people I've written for characters plenty of times that they start out as one archetype of character, like um, a stoic, sort of guarded professional, and they turn into somebody who, you know, maybe not the most, what's the word, amiable person in the world, but someone that people can go to and know that things are, they're going to be heard, things are going to happen, problems will be solved, kind of thing. Um, And I didn't think of this to ask you this before, Beth, but should we stop for questions? Should we do questions at the end? How do you want to do that?
That's entirely your call. You're welcome to stop and grab questions throughout, or if you'd rather go through and then have kind of an open forum discussion at the end, that's fine too. Whatever works best for you.
Well, since I asked the question, are there any questions so far? I mean, I know I haven't covered a whole lot, but if anybody's thought of anything.
Are your four characters here on the screen examples of personal character arcs you've written?
Uh, three of them technically, yes. The fourth one is more of a, I'd call her an antagonist, and that would be the one in the bottom left.
That
Um,
tracks. Anyone else? And if anyone's having trouble with the mute unmute functions, just give me a yell. I know that's a thing that I can help with. And chat wise also says great talk so far, very fascinating.
oh, okay. Well, thank you. I do love feedback too. All right. So let me move on to the next slide. Hopefully it works. Did it work? Is it working?
Yes, sir. It worked.
Okay. So I put on here the hero's journey isn't about slaying dragons, it's about meeting ourselves. And that, I know that sounds a little fanciful, but really the journey is all about how the characters respond to everything that they're doing. It doesn't the event doesn't have to be, oh, we're going out to slay dragons. It could be we're going out for coffee for all it really matters. It's how that shapes and defines who they are and, you know, what they're doing to grow as characters that matters. So yeah, why do arcs matter? Like I said before, they readers don't fall in love with events. They fall in love with the change in our characters. So, having static characters, again, that's fine. No one's telling anyone you must write a dynamic character that changes throughout the course of their entire life on a game or in a story or however you're using these characters. They don't have to do that. But what makes them memorable and what makes them something that not only you will revisit as a writer, but that readers will want to revisit and explore and learn is the changes that they go through. And the emotional logic that ties the story events together. If you never show how events affect your character to the audience is never going to understand who those characters are, and they're never really going to feel like they have a connection to them. And as a writer, you might not have a connection to that character, which, you know, the end of the day, we write the characters because we want to be involved in a narrative and we want to enjoy writing for those characters. So this is a way to do that. At least I think so. It's been my experience. I don't know. Your experience may vary, but um, and then arcs create catharsis, empathy, and memorability. I mean, I think I've said that a couple of times now already, but you know, a lot of times readers want that catharsis of, well, you've just put them through this. How are they now responding to that? As if they were, you know, you and me. How do they cope with it? What are their coping mechanisms? It's part of the dynamic of show don't tell. I've heard that a lot as I've learned to be a writer. Is it's better to show somebody something than just tell them, hey, character so and so did the thing. I mean, that's great, but it doesn't really show anyone anything, and it doesn't really make for good storytelling. So any questions on this particular, I guess, regurgitative slide? I didn't realize it was until. started talking about it.
If you don't have a slide like this in your presentation where you're like, wait a second, didn't I say that already? Are you really presenting?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And no, I don't have any questions.
All right. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, the truth versus the lie, or the lie versus the truth, as I put it on the screen here. Every personal arc starts with a lie. It's a false belief that your character holds about themselves that you, as the writer, are going to test, challenge, and subvert. Um, so, some really good examples of lies, and I may have put this on another slide. I can't remember. But some examples of the lie is, uh, I pull from some characters that I've written from. I've have some characters that believe that they're placed in positions that they have zero business being in. They can't do this thing. They can't be, you know, like I put one of them in the captain's chair for no other reason than I thought it was a really funny idea. And the character themselves reacts with, I shouldn't be here. I have no talents. This is not where I belong. I belong being, crewman extra number 3 in the background. And I've been testing that lie ever since. And the character has very slowly and painfully grown from that experience. And me as a writer have enjoyed writing it. I haven't actually touched that story in a little while, but I've enjoyed it as I've written it because I'm doing exactly this. I'm testing the lie that this particular character is not good enough to sit in the captain's seat and do the captain thing. Um, Granted, uh, the trigger for it was very bizarre and not exactly how you would find yourself in that position. But like I said, I thought it would be a good story, so I started writing it. And a lot of times, good character arcs start that way. Is just I'm going to put my character through something that just doesn't make sense and see how they make sense of it. And then your story will test that lie until they can no longer cling to that belief. And using the example that I just spoke about, I have not gotten to that point with this character. He's still clinging to his belief. One or two fingers may now have been pried off of this belief, but he's still clinging to it. But as you go through the story, your character will no longer cling to that, and they will start to re-examine why they ever thought that of themselves in the first place. But it will be a slow and gradual process when done right, so that the character might not even realize that they've let go of it until somebody calls them on it. That you may be interacting with another character, because I know a lot of these groups are interactive. You're not writing by yourselves. Another person's character may come along and say, hey, I've noticed a change, which that's a good thing. That tells you that what you've done with that character in this setting of a personal character arc has worked. I mean, a writer may come to you beforehand and say, hey, I've noticed that you're changing your character, long before that character interaction actually happens. But that, again, that's a good thing. Your goal was to have people notice that change, and when people come to you and say, hey, I noticed this change, everything's good. And then, you know what's left at the end is now the truth. um, it becomes the truth of that character. They now believe the thing that you started out pushing them towards at the end of the story arc. Whether they say it narratively or never say it narratively doesn't really matter. It's that now that character lives in the truth that you wanted them to live in from the start, and took the journey to get to. All right. Now we're going to touch on core archetypes. So, for the most part, there's three core narrative archetypes that you'll see in pretty much every form of media, whether it's narratively or in film or whatever. You have your positive change arc where your character will grow or they will be redeemed at some point at the end of it. So examples of those I put up there, Luke Skywalker had a very huge 3 movie, God knows how many books, arc of growth and change. And, you know, I guess I could have put Darth Vader there because the end of his arc is a redemption arc. So he goes through a negative change arc first, and then he finds himself in a positive change arc because of other people, which can happen to your character too. And then, just like I said, negative change arc. You have your corruption or downfall arcs where you may have a character who started off as an inherently good character, or they were an upstanding individual, or however the case may be, and throughout uh, their story, they slowly descend into chaos, anarchy, evil, however you want to describe that. But that's basically the character comes off worse than they started. And then you have your flat or your testing arcs, which is consistency under pressure. And flat arcs are actually probably the most prolific art in literature, where you test a character to see if they stay the same throughout whatever shenanigans you throw at them. Uh, One example is Captain Picard. Most of Captain Picard's stories are, does he still stay the same when the arc has ended? And so, you can use a flat arc multiple times to test and to reinforce your concept of the character through that consistency under pressure sort of uh, narrative device. And then, of course, everybody loves pictures, so I put some photos up there that pertain to some of the things that I put up there. Um, and are there any questions about archetypes?
You have one you like to write particularly?
Me personally, all of them. I like writing all of them because they all give you a different narrative option. So, like positive change arcs, they give you a chance to see your hero be the hero, you know, because everybody's a hero in their own story, right?
Mm-hmm.
The negative arcs, they they give me a chance to kind of, they're my what if scenario. You know, most of the stories that we write about in fiction are, for the most part, positive. Not all of them, but for the most part, they're positive and uplifting stories. But sometimes you just want to ask, well, what if this character doesn't embrace the happy shiny and they fall into despair or you know
Villain
immediate,
origin stories.
right, basically, and those are fun to write as well, because that tests not only the characters that you're writing for, but that tests you as the author to maybe do something that you wouldn't normally do. Most people don't think from the villain's perspective. That's just not something that, narratively we do a whole lot. So it gives you a chance to step outside of your comfort zone and do something that you otherwise probably wouldn't have bothered with. Everybody loves a good villain, but it's hard for a lot of writers to write that villain, you know.
So if you like all of them, what character have you written on a flat arc?
Most of my characters enjoy a flat arc at least once. I've tested plenty of characters through not just plot, but even like personal relationships. And and I think that's something that I probably should have mentioned before, is a personal character arc can be part of a larger plot, but it can also be its own thing. They don't have to be a part of something bigger. They can just be your character, and another character, and their interactions over a swath. And that could be a personal character arc that has nothing to do with any plot. That's completely independent of it. And those are
Fair
fun
enough.
too.
Anyone
Anyone
else
else?
have questions?
No. Okay. So now we get into the nitty gritty of how do we set up an arc. So obviously, the first thing to setting up the plot is to set up the plot. You establish the lie or the flawed belief. So you know, I think I've touched on this before, that you establish what the character believes in themselves that is not inherently true, or that you don't want to be inherently true at the end of the arc. A prime example of this could be, I can only rely on myself. If you have a very introverted character, you know, that lie is, well, there's no one out there who can help me but me. And so the rest of these people, I have no use for, you know. And then the second thing is the spark, which is challenging that belief. And it can be anything, you know. To take the example that I just used, someone says, "Hey, I can't rely on anybody but myself," and then you put them in a situation that they have zero ability to tackle, that falls so far outside of their scope as to lead to deer in the headlights. And then the next step is the struggle, the push and pull between their old self and the new realization that, hey, maybe my belief was flawed. And there's a lot of internal conflict and resistance that goes along with that. There's always that hesitation, or that just flat out denial that they need the thing that they believe to change. And then the next step is the shift. It's the moment of realization, or the revelation, or the choice that they make that changes their belief. So you don't necessarily, I know it kind of seems definitive that you have to have an epiphany moment, but you really don't. Some characters never consciously internalize that they have changed. Some characters, you show that they have changed in the narrative, and their behavioral patterns and the things that they do subtly change, but they never actually latch on to it consciously. It just becomes a new routine that they never did before. The introvert suddenly does extroverted things on occasion that never would have happened before, and they never really say, well, this is way outside of the normal for me. They never have that moment of this is wrong, but the reader knows, and you as the writer know, that this is not their normal anymore. And normal is they can go beyond the initial lie or the initial belief and be a different person than they were before, without really ever saying, hey, I've changed. And then the last step is the synthesis, which is your new equilibrium, you know, how they live differently after you've put them through those steps. And each of these steps should have a mirror in the external story beats. The emotional journey should track with the physical one. So, as you're going through the arc, we should see that, you know, this character behaves differently everywhere that they interact, because it has fundamentally shaped them to be different. any questions on these? Okay. All right. So the next piece is making growth feel earned. So growth is the accumulation of choices, not necessarily one big moment. It's not a speech. It's not a, it's not a grand thing. It's it's the pieces that matter, and showing those pieces is far more beneficial to not only you as the writer but the character itself than having that, you know, grand speech on the bridge and, everybody rallying behind the character. I mean, it's very cliche and it does nothing for the character. So you want to show the cracks early. If you're going to put your character through all of this, make sure people see it. You know, you can do it in subtle ways that build over time, but show it. Don't just tell people, well, the character X is now a different person. You know, show them building relationships or changing relationships or changing behavioral patterns that they have had in the past. Um, don't just tell the reader, hey, he's changed now. Isn't that cool? Mirror internal and external journeys. I've said that a couple of times, but as people are experiencing things, let them have moments, where they reflect on things, and not necessarily reflect on them in the way of, well, now I feel like I've changed. You can reflect on them emotionally, as in, you know, not being so nervous all of a sudden when interacting with a character or a group of characters or whatever, not feeling as strongly about a topic that before was the hill that they were going to die on. you know you can have quiet moments with characters that show the internal and external journey kind of marrying somewhere. you know and I feel like a lot of people shy away from, like, personal reflection scenes in a lot of writing because, you know I don't necessarily want to say that there's a stigma about having character centric stories in a collaborative community, but that's kind of how it seems sometimes, where people just don't feel like they can shine a spotlight on a quiet moment that one character has in an ensemble cast. And, so. And then I think the most important thing is let the characters choose change. You know, let it be, whether it's an unconscious or a conscious decision on their part, let it be their choice. You know, if you're writing the story and the way that you wanted them to change doesn't feel right, but a different one does, then go that way, because that's letting the character have the agency in the story. And that's what makes that growth feel all the more poignant and memorable, is because you allowed that character through your writing to choose to change that way. Um, you definitely don't want to rush these transformations. A lot of times, you'll feel compelled halfway through to be like, I've done all this work, so let's have the buy off now or the payoff now. And rushing it will undo a lot more of the work that you've done than just letting it develop as it needs to develop. Um, and then ways that it kind of feels like you didn't earn the change is if the challenge didn't test the right belief. So be wary of that. Is if you put them through something that didn't necessarily challenge the initial belief that you had, you're probably not in the right ballpark. You're close but no cigar kind of thing. And so you want to make sure that while you're writing the story, you're testing the belief that you actually want to test. You know, you can have tangential kind of challenges as well, but don't lose focus on what you're actually trying to do with the character arc. And then the lack of foreshadowing can hurt the narrative as well. If you're not throwing hints at certain points and at certain times, a lot of times readers won't actually realize that you've done the thing that you did, and then when they see the thing that you did, they're like, how did this happen? Doesn't make any sense. I've read that a few times in a few books, and I've wondered where the author pulled that one from. And even when I go back and reread it, I'm like, I can't figure it out. I don't know I don't know where it is. So that's something to be mindful of as well. And then if the character didn't choose the change, if you as the writer just said, no, I'm going to make it so even if the character, it doesn't feel right, and it I didn't go through all the steps that I needed to, but you know I invested the time, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Your reader is going to notice. They're going to notice that you forced the change. The character isn't really going to feel right anymore, and you don't want that. Any questions on that?
I don't know that I have any questions per se. I
Okay.
did want to. I appreciate you calling out the not forcing it, because I think I've seen that in a lot of places. In my experience, some of that comes from just going too fast. Like I said, wanting to like move them along to get that payoff, and then suddenly there's just not enough legs under it to make it believable.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Rushing it almost never works. I have not found a single scenario that I can recall writing myself that felt right. So, I mean, if someone can find an example, hey, I'm all for it, but I haven't. All right. So now we're going to get into, we kind of touched on this a minute ago, but we're going to get into common pitfalls and how to avoid them. Rather than having reactive characters that just react to the thing that's going on around them, you want the characters to make proactive choices. So, this gives them the agency, like I said before. It gives them agency and lets the choices cause consequences. You know, not every choice that a person or character or whatever makes should have a positive outcome. There should be consequences. That's what makes narratives successful, is that the choice doesn't always lead to the best possible outcome ever. Give them the avenues and the ability to make mistakes, to screw up, to have a moment where they are not the perfect protagonist, and then let them deal with that. Sometimes dealing with fallout makes a character so much better than someone who has never failed before. And then instant transformations, we talked about that just a minute ago. Instant transformations are a big pitfall. They do not give the character enough time and the reader enough time to see the growth happen, and then it's dissatisfactory for everyone. So you want to show incremental steps. Have them backslide. Sometimes I know I've fallen backwards when I've thought I've took 2 steps. Characters should be able to do that too. And a good character will have backslides, and they will have doubt. Doubt is probably the hardest thing for writers to let their characters feel, because they want their heroes to always be heroic. They always should be forging on ahead. We should all be Captain Kirk, and we should never be, flawed in any way that presents on screen. But that doesn't make for a good character. It doesn't make for good character arcs, and it doesn't make for good growth. Preachy dialogue. This is something that I myself have had to work on as a writer. Some of my very old characters were very preachy. I used to like to eh, dive into exposition where no exposition was required. So that's something that I've had to learn. It's something that, if you've done it in the past and you've learned from it, it's cringeworthy. You look at some of those things that you've written and God, oh man, why did I write it? But preachy dialogue, definitely a big no-no. It's too much focus on external events. You're too outside of the character and not enough inside their brain. You want to show emotional demonstrations. You know, show them, you know, if they're nervous, show them having shaky hands or unsteady stances and things like that. Show how these things are internally affecting them. You don't need them to say, I feel nervous. Show how they feel nervous. Or, I feel angry. Well, did they punch a bulkhead? Or did they just tell somebody I'm angry? Those are the kinds of things that make your growth feel better, is when you anchor them in those emotional demonstrations. And then again, growth without consequence. That's the preachy or contrived resolutions. If you grandstand and then you wave your magic writer wand and everything's okay now, really did it really matter? So you'd rather go with change with cost. What did the character have to sacrifice? What did they have to lose? Or what had to hurt them? And I say that and I realize, character torture is probably not everybody's favorite thing, but emotionally hurting a character is not a bad thing, you know. And then show how they're emotionally hurt. Show how they've had to internalize that pain and externalize it in a change in behavior. Any questions on this? Nothing hurt. All right. And let's bring it all together. Arcs don't have to be grand. They just have to be true. I think I've preached a lot about character arcs, but I probably forgot to say that they don't have to be grand events. They don't have to be a huge multi-mission or multi-story thread evolution. They just have to be true. They have to realistically, in a way that not only can a writer, or not a writer, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but not only can a reader digest and appreciate and enjoy and connect to, but you as a writer can enjoy writing and insert some of your own kind of experiences and dealings with those kinds of challenges and situations yourself. The smallest internal shift can carry the most emotional weight. That's that's a big one. You know, you don't have to have them lose a limb or somebody that they know die for them to have an internal shift. It's not always about the big moments. Sometimes it's about the quiet moments that we don't pay attention to in literature, that can make the character and the character arc itself feel so much more alive and real and grounded, even though we all know it's fiction. But having a character live through something that we've lived through and inspire an emotion and a feeling inside of us and inside our audience can feel really good. I mean, when I do it right, it makes me feel really good. And then the best arcs feel inevitable in hindsight, but invisible in foresight. So, you know, that kind of goes into the foreshadowing thing again. You can hint, and you should hint throughout the entire story, but it should never be blatantly obvious what you're going to do and where you're going to go with it. It should always be blatantly obvious at the end that, all these little clues led to this. Oh yeah, now no, everything makes sense now. I didn't understand it before, but I understand it now. Because that's how we as people look at growth ourselves. We look at our own journey as that hindsight of, yeah, it all makes sense now. Whereas, my foresight is in the negatives, I think. So, any questions or anything else? I think this is the end of the presentation. Yes, yes. So, um, so yeah, opening
Hey,
it up
thank you
to.
for presenting today.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
I enjoyed it, and I know I didn't speak up much, but I've been listening, and I think you did a good job.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Mark, of all of the character arcs you've written, and I know you've written quite a few, do you have a favorite? Like, of all of the characters and arcs and.
I think the ones that I've been doing recently are my most favorite because they're the most well developed. I think I've
Okay.
learned a lot over the years, and being able to put all of that together and write really good character arcs
So if a
now.
soul, if someone in this group was curious to read one of your character arcs, where would they go find them?
Um, so the most recent ones I've been sporadically throwing up uh, on the Bravo Fleet website, and I only do that because it's easy to throw up solo writing there and not bother people with masses of emails that they may or may not want. But some of my older stuff, I don't know if the website's still active. I have to look into it. But I used to write a, a story with other writers. It was the USS Arizona. The wife and I, uh, before she passed away, we wrote together quite a lot on that one. That ran for, oh gosh, years. And you can see you can actually, if it's still up there somewhere, you can actually see the growth of my story writing. There's some cringy stuff in there. I'm not gonna lie. Um, and won't sugarcoat it either. I wrote some cringy stuff, but it shows that writing is a process. It's not a static thing. You can learn and grow and evolve as a writer, just like your characters can grow and evolve. So,
If you have any links to those, would you drop them in chat at some point?
sure. Hold on. Let me.
Just for folks who like to reference something as an example of what you've described.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yeah. Hold on. Let me do that right now.
And in chat we have, a good example of what you're talking about is what I did for one of my characters. A past bad mission was thought to be addressed and ended up not, which required additional time with the counselor to work through the motivations and then turned into a personal mission to recover those that went through what she went through.
Yeah.
Which is actually a really cool way to do that.
Yeah. I put that in the chat there.
Awesome. Thank you.
So if anybody wants to go and read some of my most recent works, um, I know that may not be everybody's favorite place, but
That's all right.
it works for solo writing for me anyway.
Awesome. Does anybody have lingering questions? We are actually very close to up on our time here, so we need to wrap up by 5 of. So we got about 4 more minutes. If anybody has anything they want to add or questions they want to ask.
Or comments or feedback. I mean, whatever you want to do.
If not, you'll notice in the lobby there should be an ongoing set. Where did they go? Huh? There should be an ongoing set of notes about which presentations are next and where they are. So feel free to check those out. Just for everyone throughout the day, the voice panels will wrap up 5 minutes before. So there'll be a window where there's no recording from 5 of until the next presentation. So that's just something to know about. And there is a voice overflow if folks still want to talk through things. You can hop over there so that we are able to continue to record as we go along. Thank you, Mark. That was lovely.
No problem. I'm happy that folks found it informational.
Okay, without further ado, everybody take a